This is the Anthrobiology Podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. Hey there, everyone. It's been a long time. Thanks for sticking with me. Sorry I was gone so long. I'm doing okay. Thanks to the folks who reached out. I really appreciate all of you. I especially want to thank Tony. Thank you so much for writing such nice emails to me. You're so kind, and I think about you all the time. To everyone else who's written to me recently, I think I've gotten back to all of you. If I haven't gotten back to you and you've written to me, feel free to send me another email. I will totally write back. Speaking of which, I had someone else get in touch with me, and I wanted to share with you a little bit about this person. Her name is Brooklyn French, and she just started a online business where she sells coffee. And you're probably like, what the heck, Gabby? You're reading ads now? Like, that's super annoying. But the reason I'm reading this ad, well, more casually telling you about Brooklyn's business, is because it's called Anthropologist Coffee Co. And she sells all kinds of coffees, flavored and non-flavored, and part of her profits, 20% of her profits, go towards a scholarship for University of Iowa college students majoring in anthropology. And she's also an avid listener of the show, and I thought, like, she's sponsoring a scholarship. She listens to the show. I know a lot of people like coffee. She's super nice. Y'all are pretty nice. I just thought I would do this. Again, her name is Brooklyn French. Her website is anthropologistcoffeeco.com. I really am very proud of people for putting themselves out there, and especially for women who are starting a small business. So if y'all are interested, head over to the website. Again, that's anthropologistcoffeeco.com and check it out. And yeah, again, thank you all so much for sticking with me through this turbulent time. I hope you enjoy this episode with Dr. Marks. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. Joining me here today, I'm very excited to introduce Professor John Marks of the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. Hello, how are you?
Well, hi, I'm doing great.
I am so excited to have you on. I interviewed another one of your colleagues a few years ago, Dr. Sarah Youngst. If anyone's looking for a really cool episode about trepanation and tribes up in Ecuador, you should totally check that out. But we are here today to talk about your brand new book. It's called Why Are There Still Creationists, which cracked me up because I'm assuming it's a callback to that classic question that students who are creationists always ask in class, which is, if we came from monkeys, why are there still monkeys?
Oh, that's a punchline in there, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we evolved from creationists, and yet there are still creationists, aren't there? But the point of the book actually is that it's not quite that way, because modern day creationism is far more reactionary and far more radical than even the creationism of the 1920s during the Scopes trial. Because one of the things that we like to do is draw a line between William Jennings Bryan at the Scopes trial and sort of the modern day. William Jennings Bryan at the Scopes trial was an old Earth creationist, and he was very upfront about that.
I did not realize until reading your book that there was a time when there were young Earth and old Earth creationists. Like, in my head, like, those young Earth creationists, it's just one thing. Like, I hadn't realized that for a long time, a lot of creationists totally were like, yeah, there's this geological record, it's super long, but God created everything and that's fine.
From about 1830, it was pretty clear that the Earth was old, and that posed a problem for Christian theologians of the age. And they worried about, as Christian theologians of any age do, how do you be a good Christian in the modern world? And the modern world in the 1830s was clearly a very old world. And that led to a book that I mentioned in my book called Omphalos, which was published 2 years before The Origin of Species. in which the author, Ghost, tried to reconcile what he considered to be the paradox of the earth looking very old when clearly the Bible says that it's very young. And omphalos actually means belly button. And his conclusion was that in the same way that the medieval scholastics had decided that God gave Adam a belly button that he never actually used because he didn't have an umbilical cord, but God gave him a belly button to look normal. Ghost figured that God made the earth to look old, even though it really isn't. And that created a much bigger theological problem than he solved, because when he did that, he essentially invented a god that was like Loki. You're worshiping Loki here. Who would do such a thing? And so even Christian theologians of the age completely rejected what he had to say. But when Darwin wrote The Origin of Species, people like Richard Owen in England and Louis Agassiz in the United States, who were creationists, they rejected the idea that species were genealogically connected. They didn't believe the Earth was 6,000 years old. They believed the Earth was very old, but that speciation was miraculous. That was the key thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it was difficult for them, even believing in an old Earth, to accept the possibility that speciation was, or life maintaining itself, was somehow naturalistic and not miraculous. And what we see now in creationism is completely different. It's far more retrogressive and far more literalistic and stupid.
Yeah, I think that one of the main points of your book that I took away was that the issue of creationism, it's not an issue of people not understanding science. It's an issue of theology.
Absolutely. That's exactly it. And I think we get misled by pretending it's a scientific issue. We fall in debating it as if it's science. It's really a theological issue. Creationism is a theological issue. And in fact, Christian theologians are far more our allies as evolutionary anthropologists than our adversaries. We just don't hear from them very much. And the fact of the matter is, creationism isn't even really an issue in mainstream Christian theology because it's too stupid for mainstream Christian theologians.
One of the things I really appreciate about your book is that it was a really deep dive into a lot of Christian theology, things that I have not thought about since I was kicked out of CCD many decades ago. But how did we get from we have how do I put this? So how did we get from a time where creationists were like, yes, the earth is old, we just don't believe that speciation and all of that happened naturally, to today where we have these young earth creationists. And then we also have kind of more quote unquote mainstream Christian thought. But sorry, one question at a time. That's my first question.
Well, I think the modern idea of biblical literalist creationism, 6,000-year Earth and all that, that comes from really the 1960s and a book that was published called The Genesis Flood by Whitcomb and Morris. And that, as I talk about in the book, that followed up on a classic book of pseudoscience called Worlds in Collision by Immanuel Velikovsky, which basically, it wasn't creationist. He was an evolutionist, but his focus was on the book of Exodus rather than Genesis. And what Velikovsky imagined is that much of the stuff in the book of Exodus, the escape from Egypt, the 10 plagues, parting of the Red Sea, was caused naturalistically by some very easily predictable events if you just believe that the planet Venus emerged from the great red spot of Jupiter, caromed into Mars. Mars came very close to the Earth's orbit and caused all of that biblical stuff. And then those two planets settled into orbit. And it was a huge bestseller in 1950. And basically, the scientific community went out of their minds.
Yeah, I was going to say, how did astronomers feel about that?
Very unhappy. But what Velikovsky put out there was, look, you've got your science, I've got mine. And scientists, the astronomers, didn't know how to react to that. And I think that was very much a model for the anti-science of the Genesis flood, which is basically, you've got your geology and I've got mine. And in that book, evolution was really just a sidebar. They were just trying to show that the Earth, that basically everything you know about geology is wrong. And since everything you know about geology is wrong, then obviously there can't have been evolution. And if there can't have been evolution, then there wasn't evolution. And that book came out, I think, in 1961, and that forms the cornerstone of the modern creationist movement, which is quite different from creationism of previous generations.
Definitely. I think it's also interesting because one of the things that you've mentioned, even in this podcast, is that actual Christian theologians, like mainstream Christian theologians, are natural allies of evolutionary biologists. But there has been like kind of like these two parallel streams for so long. And for me personally, growing up in the South, like I didn't even realize that there were quote unquote regular Christians out there. I don't know how to say that without sounding like super hostile, but people who were Christian and didn't believe in creationism. I mean, that's not true because my mom was a Unitarian Universalist and they're great. Like they're the hippies of Protestantism. Like they're, but like beyond my mother.
There is a lot of geographical diversity here also. I mean, you're talking about Southern Baptists to a large extent in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But, this particular book had its own, shall we say, genesis in work that I was doing as a visiting fellow at the Institute of Advanced Study at Notre Dame. And I had never actually met biblical scholars before. And I taught at Yale for a decade. Yale has a great divinity school. I never knew anyone on the faculty of the divinity school at Yale because it's like, who would talk to those people? And they're probably going to try and convert me or something. And it wasn't until, 6 or 7 years ago, hanging out at Notre Dame for a year, that I began to realize that my ideas about theologians and about biblical scholars were completely wrong. And those fields are, in fact, populated now by much more sensible people than we anthropologists have come to think.
I love that you just said I was wrong, because I feel like that's something that a lot of people have a hard time saying, even in academia, where like part of the deal is that you have to say that you're wrong sometimes. So I congratulate you.
Usually I'm right.
Oh my gosh.
I'm just saying, 20 years ago, I made a couple of mistakes.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. I think that is actually something that was another component of your book that was really interesting to me, was that I had not really thought about how in earlier times, for example, with the Scopes monkey trial, that was a great example. A lot of scientists were using evolution for things that were not good, like eugenics. And it was actually Christians who were saying like, no, this is wrong. And it's interesting because I feel like we've, at least for me, I had definitely set up this dynamic in my head where it's like scientists, they're rational, they're like trying to push society forward. They're right and they're good. And, Christians, they're retrograde, they don't know what they're doing. I mean, this is a vast oversimplification of my own internal.
Well, actually, when it came to eugenics, the Protestants were generally on board, even the Southern Baptists. It was the Catholics that were against eugenics, and specifically because they were against abortion and any kind of meddling with God's role in human reproduction. And when you go back to the 1920s, human genetics and biology communities were completely on board with eugenics. I mean, this was a scientific solution to modern social problems. And the people who were against it were a very weird sort of collection of ideologues. You had the Catholics on the one hand, you had people like Clarence Darrow who wanted, individual freedoms. You had social scientists like Franz Boas who didn't like the way that the eugenicists were invoking biological models for cultural differences. And then, of course, you had conservatives who didn't want any change. And the eugenicists were very much a progressive movement. And it's not until 1927 that you get the very first biologist breaking ranks publicly with the eugenicists, and that was Raymond Pearl of Johns Hopkins. But in 1925, when the Scopes trial was on, there was no geneticist who publicly would take a stand against the eugenics movement. And Clarence Darrow, and this is one of my favorite stories, Clarence Darrow is defending John T. Scopes and does the radical act of actually reading the textbook out of which John T. Scopes was teaching evolution. And Clarence Darrow was mortified by the fact that this textbook includes sterilizing the poor on account of their bad genes and white supremacy. And as soon as the trial ends, Clarence Darrow turns from the great for evolutionary biologists. I mean, he's just been defending their views about extinct fish, for the public. And he turns into their greatest enemy. And he starts bashing these same biologists for their views about living people. He's defending their views about extinct fish, but bashing them for their living people. And he's bashing the eugenics movement in 1926 before any biologist will do that, because he's a civil libertarian.
Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting, I think that really brought into focus to me that there has been a really long history of the interaction between religion and science and other factors that make the story a lot more complicated than the simple kind of fable that it's a lot easier to tell ourselves in the modern age, if that makes sense.
Well, it's a tough lesson, but not all science is good. Not all scientific advance is good. And one of the things, where I've come from, another thing that I've learned that I was wrong about is, when I was in school and learning science, we were kind of taught that we're just producing knowledge, and how other people use that knowledge is different from the value neutral production of that knowledge. And I now realize that, no, that's not the way it is at all. You produce knowledge in a cultural context. There are questions that get asked, and there are ways that you answer them that are very much culturally inflected, and especially when it comes to things like human variation and origin narratives. So so sometimes it's the humanists that have to hold the brakes on the science. And the eugenics movement is a very nice example of that. I mean, we for 20 years, 30 years, I've been teaching about the eugenics movement. And every year, biology majors come to me after class and go, "Why didn't I hear about this in biology class?" I said, I tell them, "Don't ask me, ask your biology teacher."
I guess I have a question for you about this book, which is who did you write this book for?
The answer is you. I wrote this book actually for my colleagues who interact with creationists, but have never been able to engage with them. When you interact with a creationist, you're coming from the standpoint of data-based and rational reasoning, and you're conversing with someone who doesn't hold those assumptions about how the world works and how to understand it. And consequently, I think that when we as biological anthropologists have to engage the public who may be antithetical to the idea of human evolution because of the Bible, because of their understanding of the Bible, I think we should engage them theologically. And it's one thing to say, look, the Bible is a bunch of stories. It's another thing to say, why do we think the Bible is a bunch of stories? And here's why. And that's one of the things that I try to do for my colleagues who have to engage with people who may be hostile to the very idea of the scientific view of the origin of species.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of great examples in your book that I feel like can help people prepare for a conversation with a creationist, especially like a more considered and measured conversation with a creationist. So one of the things that I've brought up in the past, I had Kara Achenbach on from the Sausage of Science podcast, and we talked a lot about science communication and how do you talk to students in your class who are creationists, because you have like two competing forces in class. One is that you are trying to get through information by the end of the semester. Like, you're here to teach these students. And then if you have a student who's a creationist, like, that can be super disruptive, but it is worth engaging with them potentially. I don't know. How do you feel about that? How do you approach that?
Well, first of all, my advice to Kara Achenbach, who's a friend of mine and teaches at Notre Dame, is that at Notre Dame, you should not have any creationists, because the official position of the Catholic Church is that physically people evolved from apes. That's fine. And it's fascinating that there might be, well, let me rephrase that. It's fascinating that the creationist movement has made such inroads in other faiths. I mean, there are Jews, there are Catholics, there are Episcopalians who reject evolution because of what they've heard from the Southern Baptists. And if I were teaching at Notre Dame, I would just refer everyone to Pope Francis, who's the authoritative voice. However, in Charlotte, North Carolina, it's a different story. And what I do is actually I teach a lot of history and philosophy as I engage with human evolution. And I bring up all of these theological issues from the 19th century, because a lot of them are, kids still hear in their church groups or whatever. And so I teach them what the arguments were in the 1860s and 70s and why they were invalid then. Why Christian theology of the 1860s rejected certain ideas, and let them play with it. Obviously, I'm not going to try to make them into a biological anthropologist. If they really struggle with this is evil and I can't deal with it, my answer is, I'm not here to make you a scientist. I'm here to tell you what scientists think, and think of it as an ethnographic project. You have to know how anthropologists think in order to reject what anthropologists think.
That's definitely a really interesting approach. So the part of the reason this came up with Kara is that I was talking about how when I was a young, unseasoned grad student TA teaching biological anthropology, first, no one told me how to teach anything. So I was just out in the desert by myself. But I made the decision when I was going to teach the class. I said to my students at the beginning of every semester, I'm not here to debate creationism with you. I'm here to teach you about evolution. And if you want to debate creationism, you can come to my office hours, but you're not going to take up anyone else's class time talking about this. And in retrospect, I always wonder if that was the right thing to do, because I would always have like 4 or 5 kids drop at the beginning of every semester after that speech. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, that was, as an adult who has, as more of an adult who has like the benefit of time, I'm like, was that really the right thing to do?
Was there a way to have reached them?
I think you should always teach within your comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not comfortable talking about theological issues, don't, because students may know more about it than you do. That's one of the reasons I wrote this book. So you can become familiar with the theological issues and actually grapple with that for your students. There are things, I know a lot of my friends have a COVID evolution lecture now that they integrate into their biological anthro. I don't have one because I'm not comfortable lecturing on COVID or its evolution. So I let virologists handle that. I stick with biological anthropology as much as I can. And I define anthropology widely enough so that I think biblical scholarship and ideology, religious ideologies actually come under the banner of anthropology. And I like to think of myself as a general anthropologist who can talk about comparative religious systems as well as human origins.
Yeah, I think that this is a really valuable book. I know that grad schools probably won't start doing this, but in my dreams, they will take brand new grad students and give them a book like this, and also give them some classes on how to teach. Maybe.
So the second part is, I mean, a lot of universities now do have tutoring courses for graduate students on how to teach. I know mine does.
I feel like I muddled my way through. I was fine. But that's also because I taught children horseback riding for a long time before I showed up there. But I think that maybe some of the tactics of teaching children horseback riding don't necessarily translate into the classroom. But yeah,
my best experience for teaching, I'm much better in a lecture class than I am in a seminar, and I've known that for decades. But that's because my best experience in teaching was theatrical experience, being up on a stage, thinking about what you're doing with your hands, thinking about what you're going to say, and that kind of stuff helped me sort of present myself in front of a class. The last thing you want to be is Sewell Wright, absentmindedly erasing the blackboard with a guinea pig. Although that does make it into the legends of education.
Yeah. It's definitely really interesting. I do think that this, if anyone out there is listening and they're like wondering, they're grappling with how to deal with students who are creationists, I think this book is really great. My question for you is, say a student picks this up who is either a literalist or like a biblical literalist, or just like kind of vaguely Christian, like their parents are Christian and they're kind of creationist, but they don't know why. Because I think that both of those very much exist. What do you think the reaction to your book would be?
Well, I think there will be a little devil on their shoulder telling them to burn it, and a little angel on their shoulder telling them to read it more carefully. It's very hard to predict. If anything I've written affects anyone positively, I'm tickled to death about it. But because that's why one writes books, is to have an effect on people.
Mm-hmm.
And if it does, I'm grateful for that.
Have you had any pushback on this book?
Well, it's only been out for a couple of months, so the answer is no. But there haven't been any reviews yet. Everybody who has read it has told me they love it, but that's to my face. You know what they say behind your back. Welcome to academics.
That's very true. That's also a running theme on this show, is that there's a lot of politics and academics that doesn't get talked about with the general public.
Oh, absolutely. Good gosh. I mean, going back to my early years in biological anthropology, in the 90s when I was an assistant professor, one of the reasons that I got into so much trouble as an assistant professor is that I was raising issues that the generation above me didn't want to hear about. And now I realize that they were all sort of linked. I was interested in talking about scientific racism. I was interested in talking about scientific fraud, and I was interested in talking about scientific colonialism. Nobody wanted to talk about that in the 1990s, but all that stuff is on the table now. And biological anthropologists of the current generation are far more interested in those kinds of questions than they were, 30 years ago.
Yeah, it brings more of that humanist perspective to the science, which, as you've pointed out again and again in your book, is super important so that we don't do evil things.
Decolonizing the science is now a big watch phrase, and I think that's a hugely important issue. I mean, if you think biological anthropology is sort of the handmaiden of colonialism.
Yeah. Question for you, because I realized we didn't actually cover this. Besides this book, which was a huge endeavor in and of itself, what is it that you normally do at UNC Charlotte? Like, what do you normally research? What's your deal?
I hang out and make trouble. That's what I've been doing for a very long time. I started out as a lab geneticist. I mean, I started out as essentially a pseudo-geneticist. That is to say, I mean, I have some training in genetics and I use technology from genetics, but I was importing it into anthropology. And I did that for about 10 years when I was an assistant associate professor at Yale. Then I moved to Berkeley in 97, and I spent 3 years there as a one-year visitor. Well, once you're out of a lab for 3 years, you're not going to be, especially in genetics, technology just passes you by. So when I came to Charlotte in 2000, I essentially transitioned from being a pseudo-geneticist to being a pseudo-historian. And the important thing there is to use the same methods and the same technologies that real historians do. And this has actually been a problem in the history of biological anthropology, which until fairly recently had tended to be written by the old farts. And you can't rely on histories written by old farts because obviously they've got their own agendas and their own things that they're trying to convey in the record. And historians had not yet gotten interested in biological anthropology. They kind of got transfixed by Darwin, and historians of biology kind of stopped with Darwin. And a few of them started moving beyond Darwin. So you've got some people sort of working on the evolutionary synthesis, like Betty Smokovitis. And then you had people who were starting to get interested in the history of human genetics, like Susan Lindy at Penn. And from there, you had real historians starting to work on how anthropologists had thought about evolution, which is a little bit different from the way Dobzhansky or Darwin, did. And so there are real historians. John Jackson is another one who's been working on the history of biological anthropology. And there is some real history out there now. And some of it would kind of freak you out to know about. Shall I ramble on?
Yeah, feel free. I think that this is the kind of thing that a lot of times gets glossed over, well, at least when I was an undergraduate, which again, decades ago. I'm getting old. Things are changing,
not as fast as I am.
I think they're changing for the better. But certainly when I was an undergraduate, this was not something that was covered in depth.
Well, when I started out in the late 70s, I took my first class in anthropology in graduate school in the late 70s. I had no anthropology as an undergraduate. I was a straight biology major at Johns Hopkins. And well, it turns out that in 1962, the president of the AAPA, American Association of Physical Anthropologists, which, by the way, no longer exists, partly, I think, as a long-term consequence of the story I'm about to tell, but the president of the AAPA was a physical anthropologist from Penn named Carlton Kuhn. And he was a huge intellectual figure, and he was a popular scientist as well. He was on TV in a show called What in the World, and you can still see a few episodes of this on YouTube from the archives of the Penn Museum. Anyway, Carlton Kuhn wrote a book called The Origin of Races, pretentiously titled to invoke Darwin, of course. And in this book, he raised the hypothesis and remember, this is 1962, that there were 5 races of Homo sapiens, which was normative, I suppose, for the age, and there were 5 races of Homo erectus in the Pleistocene, and they could be connected up to each of the living human races. And that those 5 races of Homo erectus evolved into Homo sapiens one at a time, whites first, 200,000 years before blacks. So what he seems to be saying is, oh, here's just a hypothesis. I know there's all this stuff going on about civil rights and stuff like that. Why are black people making so much trouble about civil rights? Well, it's because they haven't been members of our species very long. And why do they want to be in the same schools as white children? Well, that would be unfair, wouldn't it? I mean, if you got some people who are 200,000 years behind other kids, you can't put them in the same schools. So even though he didn't literally say that in the book was taken as an absolute guidepost by the segregationists. And the physical anthro community was stuck in the position of having their leading, scholars, spokesman, be basically a hatchet man for the segregationists. And at the 1962 meetings of the AAPA, let me backtrack. Carlton Kuhn, we now know, was corresponding with and working with the segregationists. We know that because we have his mail. That's the wonderful world of archival research. But at the time, all they could do was suspect it. And you can't really go out and accuse the president of the AAPA of colluding with the segregationists without hard evidence. So basically, that episode in the history of physical anthropology, are we just hacks for evil political machines, or do we have something really to say about human diversity in a positive sense? I think really shaped physical anthropology for the next generation. Unconsciously. I was never taught Carlton Kuhn's The Origin of Races. I discovered it sort of on my own and read it on my own. And I knew it was controversial because of something about, parallel evolution in 5 different groups. But I didn't understand that he was, in fact, working with the segregationists, and he was making our field look terrible out there. And that's only come out in the last, 10, 15 years with the archives. And now it puts us in a position to be able to think about our field and our work in a much different way. We're not amoral. We are not apolitical. What we're doing here when we talk about human diversity and human origins is intensely political and intensely ideological. And the best we can do is to try and make the ideology and the politics in what we do as harmless as possible and as benign as possible, because we've certainly seen the effects of doing the opposite.
Yeah. Another ongoing theme of the podcast. I know you said you didn't listen to podcasts before we started, but maybe you should listen to this one. You might get a kick out of it. Is one of the things that the show has been talking about and dealing with a lot is the use of ancestry or race in biological profiles for forensics.
Mm.
And I think that that's like a perfect example of what you're talking about, and it's something that the field is actively trying to work through. Like, is this something that we can continue providing? So anyway, I think that there are a lot of practical applications of what you're saying.
Well, 30 years ago, you had George Armelagos and Loring Brace pretty much as the only people on the bone side of things who were saying that what you just described is not a good place for us, either intellectually or politically. And now, of course, that's a normative position in biological anthropology. So the point is the field is evolving.
Yeah.
And it's never, I think the important thing about biological anthropology is that it will never be and should never be biology. Because, as Carlton Kuhn actually once said to Theodosius Dobzhansky, and it's something I think we can all agree on, if the study of fruit flies were a prime social and political issue, Dobzhansky might well be in the trouble that he's been putting me, Carlton Kuhn, into. We have a responsibility in being the custodians of a scientific narrative about people. And that is that we are custodians of a political and social narrative here. And we can't pretend that those components don't exist.
Yeah. Yes. That was extremely well stated. And I'm just going to end the interview there and switch to my final 3 questions, if that's okay with you.
Okay.
So first question is, if someone wanted to learn more about your field of study, where is a good place for them to start? And it is okay to self-promote because people always get weird about it, but you should.
I did write a textbook called The Alternative Introduction to Biological Anthropology. And the reason it's an alternative is that it sort of articulates my own worldview about where biological anthropology ought to be, both intellectually and politically, socially. It incorporates the kinds of political issues and the history of the political issues that we've been talking about. So that's probably the place to go if you want to get inside my head.
Excellent. What are you reading for work right now?
What am I reading for work? On my table to the left, I've got Blood Relations by Jenny Bangham. And Jenny is a historian, a real historian who's working on the way in which the study of the blood impacted both biomedical science and racial science. And of course, it was the biological anthropologists who were integrating it into racial science. So that's top on my list right now. I'm looking at Johannes Krauss and Thomas Trapp, A Short History of Humanity. Mm-hmm. They're working on the ancient DNA of Europeans. And so that sort of summarizes that work. And Sonia Shaw, The Next Great Migration, which is about the role of gene flow in modern human populations.
Those all sound super interesting. I'm definitely going to have to.
They are indeed.
Buy some of those.
If I can only finish them, I'll be a happy man.
And then final question for you. What are you consuming for fun right now?
For pleasure, non-bioanthro?
Yes.
I am reading the autobiography of a former colleague of mine, Michael Coe, great Mayan archaeologist. And his autobiography is called Final Report, An Archaeologist Excavates His Past. I'm reading a most peculiar book, which, by the way, it refers to the Bible. And that's by a biblical scholar named Kristen Swenson. And the third book that I'm reading for pleasure is actually the most interesting. And that is called Eslanda, The Large and Unconventional Life of Mrs. Paul Robeson. And Paul Robeson is one of my culture heroes, and it turns out his wife was actually an anthropologist. And that book is by Barbara Ransby.
Huh. Those all sound super interesting. And I'm also glad to hear that other people read multiple books at the same time.
Oh, yeah, I can't remember anything, but I certainly scan the words.
Oh, my goodness. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It was truly a pleasure. If anyone is curious about learning more about our conversation, I do strongly recommend reading Why Are There Still Creationists? And yeah, I would love to have you back on sometime.
Thank you, Gabby. It'll be a pleasure.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. This show is produced by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear at Sound of Picture.